So the Nvidia 970, despite having this VRAM issue over at Nvidia, it's still a fantastic card, bringing good performance at 1080p, 1440p, but can it game at 4K? Stay tuned for this video to find out the results. So we're going to kick this video off with some benchmarks for the Nvidia 970 gaming at 4K. We're going to be looking at various amount of games and benchmark programs to see if this card can actually game at 4K. Okay, before we begin the benchmarks, can I just mention we overclocked our 970 to 1400 MHz, so a couple more frames over the stock 970 there and there. So the first game we benchmarked was Battlefield 4. We're on the Ultra preset settings. Everything was turned up to Ultra, and we had 4 times MSAA, so plenty of anti-aliasing, even though we probably don't need it for this high resolution, but still nice. So we averaged around 38 frames per second, very good indeed. Not quite the 60 frames per second that I always prefer to game above, because I always prefer 60 frames per second to 30. But 30 is still playable. And 38 frames per second, almost 40 frames per second, guys. Still very playable. It's smooth. I wouldn't say butter smooth, because 60 frames per second is what I class as butter smooth. But the minimum was 22 frames per second. That's okay. We didn't get to this frame rate very often. Only in very intensive battle scenes between like tanks. We had explosions going off, players fighting everywhere, lots of explosions, lots of tanks, everything. And can I just note, this was a 64 player map, so yeah, quite intensive battle scenes. The only thing I would complain about, if you are buying this card for 4K gaming, that 22 frames per second between that very intensive scene can cost you a bit, especially if you're a competitive gamer, which that high frame rate is essential. A maximum 64 frames per second, that too was a very rare occurrence as well, 64 frames per second. But still averaging about 38 frames per second, I'm very impressed indeed with this card at 4K. So the second game we benchmarked was Shadow of Mordor, and we put it to the very high preset. We can't do Ultra because that requires 6 GB of frame buffer. Very high settings. We had FXAA. Everything was turned to very high as well, and we averaged around 34 frames per second. Still, for the average, we're not going under 30, which is actually really good. And it's really good if you work for Ubisoft, because 30 frames per second is very cinematic for games, of course. But 34 frames per second, still not 60 frames per second I like, but still. This card was not designed for 4K in the first place, so 34 frames per second is excellent really for 4K gaming on this card. It's not like we've got a Titan X, 2 980s, and yeah, it's a really good card. For a little bit of 4K gaming, I would still recommend 1440p for this card, but still, quite smooth for 4K. Our maximum was nearly around 60 again. That didn't occur very often, and minimum was 24 frames per second. Okay, it dipped a bit to 24 frames per second when we actually started fighting a war chief, because I don't know, he calls all his minions and stuff. They all come together. That requires a bit more horsepower to render in all those orcs and all that. But still, I am quite impressed with what results we managed to get today. Okay, so the Nvidia 970 overall, I am very impressed with the frames per second we got in our games we tested. We didn't even go under 30 frames per second, which is fantastic, and yeah, more cinematic than what you said, Ubisoft. 35 frames per second is like what we averaged for all the games in total. We averaged around 35 frames per second across all games. 34 frames per second was the average for Shadow of Mordor, 38 for Battlefield 4. Overall, I'm very impressed. We never went below 30 for our averages. Minimums did go into 20s, but not for too long. And max frames per second were around 60. So overall, what do I have to say about the 970 at 4K? Well, I would still say it's not for 4K because of that under 60 frames per second. It's just me personally, I would not get this game at all for 4K. Because I'm someone who has to game above 60 frames per second because every frame is crucial for me. And plus, if it lags a lot, I won't be able to play it as well. I won't be able to react quicker to stuff in games. So if you are a competitive player and like 4K, this card is definitely not for you because those high frames per second is crucial if you're a competitive gamer. So what do you think of the Nvidia 970? Do you think it's a good card for 4K? Let me know in the comments down below. Would you get a 970 just for gaming? Or would you just leave it for 4K or save it for the big brother, the 980? Or does the 3.5 VRAM issue still put you off a 970? Let me know in the comments below. Anyway guys, I've been MLC, otherwise known as Matthew. If you want more videos like this in the future, I do gaming and tech videos and more gaming news and all that good stuff. If you want more videos like this in the future, make sure to subscribe, because I got a whole bunch of technology videos planned out for this year. Anyway guys, I'm MLC, hope to see you in another video, and goodbye.